Excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros is the new brand under which African Ascent International, as it has been previously called for the past 15 long years, will be launching in the first episode with Rami Khouri. What a blessing. Rami Khouri does not really need an introduction at the expense of embarrassing him. I simply want to say the following. In my judgment, and it's a carefully worked out judgment, Rami Khouri is simply speaking the leading Middle East analyst by all measures.
Oh dear.
He is an analyst, he is a journalist, he is a policy participant, he is an author, he is a writer. I remember Rami Khouri when he was 20 years younger, when I met him at a Harvard party that was hosted by one of his relatives, the great Nuha Khouri, who is a noted art historian who graduated from Harvard University. 20 years later, fate had it such that at Berklee College of Music, I and Professor Victor Wallace decided to invite Rami Khouri, tantalized by his achievements. And then I was mesmerized by some of his distinguishing characteristics, which is very unusual for most journalists who are unnecessarily dramatic. His style is calm, his judgment is judicious, his presence is impeccable, he is fair, he knows his subject with remarkable mastery of historical details. So it is really my great honor, and I speak from my heart, to invite Rami Khouri for the next 1 hour to give us a crash course on the catastrophic facet of the human condition as it is unfolding right in front of our eyes in Palestine, when human beings like you and me are being massacred, killed, and accounted for, as if life, which is short, is not enough. Wars have this remarkable tendency to cut life shorter. Welcome to Excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros, an inauguration episode for the first time, Mr. Rami Khouri.
Thank you.
My first question is essentially going to be to ask you to do what you do extremely well, very briefly, that is, to give us a history of the Middle East, most particularly the history of Palestine, by treating maybe the Ottoman Turkish period at the benchmark, and then bring us to the present.
Well, I'm not a historian, but as a journalist and analyst of contemporary affairs, and I've lived through the last 55 years of the Middle East as a working journalist, an analyst, and commentator, and a chronicler is what I like to call myself, to chronicle what's going on, not just to describe the facts, but to try to understand who are the forces, what are the forces at play, who are the new actors, where did they come from, why were they born, what are they aiming to do? Some of them are violent, some are peaceful, some are in between. And what I try to do is analyze these things, identify why we're experiencing what we're experiencing today. It's especially a gruesome situation in Gaza and elsewhere. But we've had a lot of action in the last 55 years, during which I've worked as a chronicler and a reporter and writer in the region. But you can't really understand what's going on in the Arab-Israeli arena, especially, unless you understand some of the history, because this is very much a conflict that has essentially been going on now for about 130 years, something like that. And it started in the 1890s, and we are still in the middle of this conflict, which gets more violent, more bitter, more difficult to resolve, but I believe can still be resolved. So the early history that one should keep in mind about this conflict in this region. I mean, you can go back as far as you want. You can go back to the beginning of civilization, human settled civilization in the Neolithic period, and then work up through the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And I wrote books on archaeology in the Middle East, so I've done this actually. And what's fascinating is you find in ancient history some of the issues that you find today. You find urban pluralism. You find it in Roman cities, Greek Roman cities. You find different population groups, different ethnic groups living together inside a walled city. And you still see that reflected today in the remnants of these cities, even some of the still living cities. So if you go to Damascus or Jerusalem, you see, or Beirut, you see the ethnic religious quarters. You see the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Sunni Muslim, the different people living together inside one city, but they're different identities, different ethnic and religious identities. They may form one nationality. After you had nations and states, you had passports. So you find in Lebanon, they all have Lebanese passports, but they're different identities. And so this tradition of pluralism throughout history is part of the Middle East legacy. It's really an important part. This was pretty much shattered, and this continued under the Ottomans. For 400 years that the Ottomans controlled much of the Middle East, not all of it, but certainly the heartland of the Levant, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, parts of Iraq, parts of Egypt, and bits and pieces of North Africa here and there. They didn't control much of the Gulf or the inland areas. But you had, during the Ottoman era, still the pluralism continued, but under an overall Ottoman umbrella. And some of these people in the Levant, in West Asia, let's call it, were represented in the parliament in Istanbul. So they were Ottoman citizens. And this then was pretty much shattered by the birth of modern nationalism, the birth of the modern nation state, which started in Europe sometime in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, or wherever you want to identify the beginning. And then it came to the Middle East with colonialism. And the particular moment when this Euro-national mechanism or legacy came into our region and shattered the former traditional patterns of coexistence. And when I say coexistence, it doesn't mean they didn't argue and have fights and kill each other once in a while. Everybody does that. They do it in Chicago, they do it in London, they did it in the Ottoman Middle East, so it's not a strange thing. But generally, there was coexistence among different groups. What happened in the late 19th century is really the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict in Europe in 1896, 1897. You started to get small groups of European Jews who understandably exasperated, degraded, dehumanized, fed up with the racism, the pogroms, and the discrimination, the humiliation that they suffered, the anti-Semitism, which was suffered at the hands of white Christian Europeans. That's important to remember, as well as white Christian North Americans. You had this tradition in Russia, heavily, in Europe also, and North America. And there were these people who were in power who didn't like Jews for some reason, which is an issue for historians to resolve. But the continued aggression against Jews and discrimination, some were killed, some were contained in ghettos, and different terrible things happened in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century to Jews and to other minorities, but the Jews were the most important one. Well, they said, we can't live like this anymore. Not all of them, but small groups said we need to create a Jewish state. As country, because there were countries being created all over the world as the beginning of decolonization happened and empires started to break down. So the the Zionist movement came to being in 1896, 1897. They had the first Zionist Congress in Basel. I think it was 1896 or 97. And they said, we want to create a Jewish state. And they looked around and they tried to contact the Ottoman Caliph, and they contacted European leaders. Say, where can we get a piece of land? And they were looking at Uganda. They were looking at Argentina. They were looking at other places. But finally, the Jews who were the first Zionists said, no, we want Palestine, because there always had been a Jewish presence in Palestine, which is true. The Jews of Palestine around that time made up maybe 2-3% of the population. They're small communities of really Palestinian Arab Jews. They lived in an Arab culture, predominantly a Muslim Arab culture, with a large Christian minority, maybe 8% or something like that, and a small number of Jews, maybe 2-3%. And they pretty much coexisted. There's no record of really serious intercommunal violence in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The Jews tended to be merchants. Some were professionals. They were in cities like Acre, Safed, Jerusalem, Hebron, other places. They were prominent local people. And all the testimonies we have were that they were respected members of the community, and they respected the community. This was shattered again by the beginning of the process by which the Zionist movement of European Jews who had come to Palestine and started to generate European imperial support from the British came and said, we're going to we want a home. They called it a homeland, but of course they're meaning they wanted their own state. And the indigenous Palestinian Arabs at first had no problem with this. They welcomed them, and they said, oh, of course, we've always had Jews here. If you're mistreated in Russia, come on over. And they came in small numbers from 1890 to 1920 or something like that. In small numbers, it wasn't a huge problem at all. But then in the 1920s, you started to really get the tensions, because the numbers started to grow. You'd have 10, 15,000, 20,000 coming in some years. And this started to upset the balance. And then, of course, what happened in the meantime, other than the relationship between the Jews, Zionists on the one hand, and the indigenous Palestinian Arabs, Christian Muslim Arabs, other than their relationship, you had the British came in and replaced the Ottomans. At the end of World War I, the British were given a mandate by the League of Nations to administer Palestine, and like all imperial, slightly Orientalist, racist mandates, that assuming that these local people didn't know how to run themselves, we better help them and teach them. So the British were given charge of Palestine and also what became Jordan east of the river and Iraq, and the French had the areas of Lebanon and Syria to take care of. And the British, for different reasons, one being the influence of a strong Christian fundamentalist lobby in London, who thought that the return of the Jews to Palestine heralded a great new messianic age of saving the world. And as the Bible says, the Jews have to be gathered into Palestine, and they'd either all become Christians or they'd all be killed. And then the Messiah would come, and the world would live for 1,000 years in peace. So Christian fundamentalists pushed for this, and the imperial British authorities in London pushed for this, because they thought, back in between 1914, 1918, when the Ottomans and the British were fighting, and the French and the British on one side, and the Ottomans, they were fighting for control of the Middle East. As the Ottoman Empire declined, the British came in, and they thought, well, if we supported the Zionist state, we could get some valuable support from the European Jews in different ways. And that was their reason in London for supporting the Jewish state idea, other than the Christian fundamentalist messianic extremists who thought that this was a way to bring the next coming of the Messiah. And these things all came together. The Arabs were completely unprepared to deal with this. So the Arab society in Palestine was reasonably sophisticated in the urban centers like Jaffa and Haifa and Jerusalem and a few others. You had some quite sophisticated institutions of civil society, of culture, of art, of education, business, a tremendous amount of international commerce. But they were not politically very savvy. They had a traditional political system where notables of the big families, who tended to be big, merchants as well, they kind of made all the decisions, and most of the people went along with them, and people lived reasonably happily. So, but the system was not organized for ordinary people to express their political views, nor did they have the ability to compete in Europe and then later in the United States with the Zionist groups, who were Europeans and were very savvy, smart, professionally successful, plugged in, well-connected, wealthy, influential people here in Paris and London and elsewhere who could go and see the prime minister because they were prominent local members of those communities. So they were Europeans, and at the same time, they were budding Zionists who wanted to become Israelis. And they were able to influence, the Zionists in Europe were able to influence the decisions of the Europeans, mainly the British in 1917, to issue the Balfour Declaration, which said Britain will support the creation of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. It was just a very short one-paragraph statement. And that was the turning point where you had an imperial power that was soon to take over. They issued the statement some months before the British actually controlled Palestine militarily, but they were committed. An imperial, one of the strongest imperial powers of the day, was committed to supporting the creation of a Jewish homeland. And this created a huge push for the Zionists to bring in more people, to start organizing. They had, military training. They tried to develop businesses and agriculture, all kinds of things to start creating their state without saying that they were creating a state. And then, as the Nazis started to take power in the 30s, the European Jews were incredibly, desperate to flee because when they realized what was going on, and the European racist white governments, the British especially, and the North American one as well, the United States, they wouldn't let the Jews come in. The Jews were desperate. Many Jews were desperate to flee the Nazis, and they had nowhere to go. So many of them then came to Palestine. So then you suddenly, in the 1930s, had a much bigger flow of refugees coming in, and then the balance of population between Jews and Arabs started to change. The Jews made up then 10% and 15% of the population. And the Arabs realized that this was not just a sentimental, desire to go back to the old country from thousands of years ago. This was the plan to create a Jewish state in the land that was 97% Arab. And the Arabs were not able to stop it. The Palestinians did not have the lobbying savvy, the knowledge, the experience. They didn't have the connections. They didn't have the imperial support. They tried to present their case at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I and other places, but the Zionists were just way too sophisticated and plugged in. And then in 1947, to cut it short, the problem in Palestine became one of intercommunal clashes between the Arabs, who were still a majority, but a smaller majority than before. So the Arab population was around maybe 60%, 65%. The Jews were about 35, 40%. The Arabs were still a small majority, but the British were helping the Jews to create their state with military funding and training and restrictions on the Arabs. And then I'm giving you a quick shorthand. There were many, many different kinds of things going on. And finally, in 1947, the British, as colonial imperial powers tend to do, totally irresponsibly and recklessly said, look, we made a mess of this. We don't know what to do. Let's turn it over to the UN. The UN had just been created. So they sent the issue of Palestine to the UN. And in 1947, the UN planned a debate in, I think, November to discuss what to do about Palestine. And there were various proposals, but the one that won, which is the one that the Zionists wanted, was partition. The Arabs didn't want a partition. The Arabs were saying, look, this is a country with, now there's a lot more Jews here, but there've always been Jews, but the Jews can't determine the political system that governs everybody. The system has to be governed by some mechanism where all the citizens in a democratic and participatory and pluralistic way contribute to national decision-making and governance. And it still wasn't an independent country. It was a mandate under the British. But again, the Zionist groups were way too sophisticated and too well connected, especially with the Americans by this time. The Americans were involved, and they got a lot of pressure from the Americans on a few small countries, tiny little island states here and there to vote for partition. And back then, I think the General Assembly had something like, I can't remember the number, 55 or something like that members. Now it's 147 or something like that. But the General Assembly debated and under American British pressure voted for partition. And the partition plan was very unfair. It gave the Israelis a slight majority of the land, where they were a minority of the population. They split the land into an Israeli state, a Jewish state, an Arab state, and the area around Jerusalem would be an international zone. Because of the holy sites and all that. And partition was voted in 47. And that's when you started to get the really serious military confrontations, because two things happened. First, the Zionist groups who had been working for the last 30 years, training militias, training their people, getting arms, smuggling in arms from different European countries, they were prepared. And what they started to do, and this is well documented by Israeli historians, Arab historians, Western historians, people like Ilan Pappé, for instance, in Israel, has a tremendous book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. There's many, many you can get, but the documentation is clear that the Zionist groups, before the state was created, formally announced May 1948. From November 47 to May 1948, you started to get action by the Zionist militias who were pushing Arabs out of their villages, out of their neighborhoods. They were attacking them in urban areas. And the plan was to get as many of them out as possible. Now, if you look at what's going on in Gaza today, it's not very much different from that. The difference being that back then, the people doing this were not an organized state as Israel is today. They were the groups of pre-state militias. There was 3 or 4 of them, and they didn't all agree. Occasionally, they fight with each other, but the Jewish groups. But most of the time, they had the same aim. They wanted to get as many Palestinians out of the area of Palestine. So when they created their Jewish state on May 15, 1948, is the day when the British were pulling out. They can get as much territory as possible. And they ended up succeeding. And when the Jewish, and then Arabs, of course, fought back. So you had communal warfare going on all over the place in different forms. But the Zionists were way more sophisticated, better equipped, better trained, better led, and more focused. And whether this was due to the fact that they were emerging from a Holocaust in Europe or other things, historians will debate this, but they were able to drive out or cause to flee about 750,000 Arabs, which is about half the Arab population. There's about 1.5 million Arabs then in Palestine. And half of them, 750,000, after the 1948 declaration of the state and the partition, and the Israelis declared their state on midnight of the 15th, and the US was the first to recognize it, I think. And then intercommunal fighting happened, and more people were driven out. So by the end of the initial period of warfare, which was a couple of months, you had 750 out of the 150,000 Arabs outside of Palestine. And they were either driven out or they fled because they saw their neighbors were driven out and villages were burned and people were killed. And the Israelis, the groups doing this, showed what they were doing to show the other Arabs, look, you better get out of here because this is going to happen to you, which is very similar to what's going on in Gaza today. The Israeli government is doing terrible things to show the Palestinians there that if you don't do what we want you to do, you're going to suffer some terrible fates. And again, I'm shortening this, but this is the broad flow of events. And the Israelis created their state. But an important thing to recognize is that of those 750,000 Palestinians who found themselves outside Palestine in 1948 when the state was created, about half of those, about 370,000, were driven out before May 1948. So they were driven out before the state of Israel was created and before the war between Israel and a few Arab countries started. And that wasn't a very serious war because the Arab countries were not very good at warfare or leadership or equipment, or they didn't have anywhere near the capabilities that the British did, that the Zionists, the Israelis did, because they were helped by the British and European countries and others. But this is important, that half of the 750,000 Arabs who were made refugees in 48 had become refugees before the war started as part of the ethnic cleansing plan by the Israelis against the Palestinians. And this is a pattern that has continued until today. So what we're seeing today in Gaza is just large-scale ethnic cleansing. 2 million people. The Israelis would like to drive them all out of Gaza if they can. They might. We don't know. I mean, it'd be amazing if it happens. It'd be astonishing and in a cruel and criminal way if it happened, and the rest of the world just watched it on social media. But it might. We don't know. But we can see how these things happen when you have warfare around you and suffering. People desperate for food or medicine or safety, they'll leave. They'll pick up their kids and they'll go. And you saw this in Ukraine. You see it in every battle, any war around the world. People get out of the way of a war. And the result was that Israel was created in 1948. It ended up having around 78% of the land of historic mandated Palestine. The part that was left was the West Bank and Gaza. The Egyptians were given administrative authority over Gaza. The Jordanians were given authority over the West Bank. And later, a few years later, Jordan offered citizenship to all the Palestinians who wanted it. And many of them took it, including my own parents who were out of the country in 48. My father was a journalist. He was actually in New York covering the debate at the UN. And when Israel was created, he wasn't allowed to go back. So he was stateless for a few years. And then when Jordanian citizenship was offered to the Palestinians in the West Bank, he took it. So that's why today we have Jordanian citizenship. I also have American because I was born in New York in that year, in 1948. So that's just a quick overview of, how did the land that was 97% Arab become, and 3% Jewish, today, the historic land of Palestine, how is it that it became 80% Jewish and 20% Arab? This is not a normal transition. This is not a normal demographic transition. So the debate goes on between Zionists and Palestinian Arab nationalists about how this happened, but the historical facts are pretty clear. It's clear to Israelis and Arabs and others that these things happened more or less as I mentioned them. I didn't give all the details. So the question is, how do we overcome this? the Zionists, the Israelis and the Jews will tell you, some of them will say, look, we had no choice. It was either get killed or save your son, save your family. And so this is a very powerful argument. But the idea that you save your family by making another Arab family destitute and stateless and disenfranchised and exiled and living in a refugee tent, that's not a very pleasant equation, but that's what happened. Anyway, so that's the background, and here we are. Since then, you've had continuous warfare between the state of Israel, which was created, became quite strong, and Arab surrounding states got pulled into this. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, not too much, Jordan, Iraq, a little bit. And so what was a contest between Jewish European Zionists and Palestinian Arab individuals turned into a wider Arab-Israeli conflict once the Israeli state was created. And the Israeli state, like the Jewish Zionists early on, had way more sophisticated capabilities, training, equipment, support, connections. They had intimate links with people around the Western world because they came from there. And there's other reasons too. Many people in the West said, "Oh, this is the land of the Jews. Moses, God gave it to Abraham, and then Moses led the Jews into the Promised Land." And so there's different biblical reasons, emotional reasons, political, ideological reasons why people supported Israel so strongly. But one of them was that the Palestinians and the Arabs were totally incompetent at waging that battle, whether it was the military battle or the public relations and information battle. Now, what's interesting is that all those things have changed today. We can talk about that later, but so when you look at today, the incredible amount of information coming from Palestinians and others on the social media, on the mainstream media and universities, there's tremendous amount of information that's documented and shared now. So we've overcome that imbalance. And militarily, the Arab state armies have not done that well fighting Israel, but what you've seen is Hezbollah and Hamas, two non-state actors who became very powerful, and they have challenged Israel and to a large extent checked it. Now, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Hamas, and Palestine have different.
Okay. Let me briefly intervene, Rami. First of all, I want to thank you exactly what I expected, namely a self-contained course on the history of the present condition. That was brilliant. Now, let me get into something that you've been thinking about lately, very originally, namely this discussion of the axis of resistance, as you called it, which is precisely a continuation of what you are about to embark on. Let's relate that to what has been famously called the colonial condition, the imperial project, and so on, tirelessly. And then lately, in a very organized way, you've been attempting to give a presentation of what Hamas is all about, without necessarily paying a blind eye to the tragedy of October 7th, which you and many intelligent analysts like you call that by the right name, namely that it was an exercise in a desperate practice of terrorism, which by any human standards is a practice that any reasonable human being would find abhorrent, as you did. But you have developed a technique by which we can understand what happened on October 7th through this concept of the axis of resistance. It's very poetic and very analytic and a good organizational device, I thought. So we have about 20 minutes or so left. I would like you to devote it to that. And then if we run out of time, we might have to do part two in the future. But you'll just give us, following that discussion, your vision of the debate between the two-state solution and the one-state solution. And the
Right.
one-state solution, of course, could be historically related to the earlier relationships between Jews and Arabs and both Muslims and Christians that you described for us remarkably well. So, what do you mean by the axis of resistance?
Well, it's not a term I coined. This is a term that was coined by the various groups and countries and movements that are part of this axis of resistance. It used to be called the Resistance and Deterrence Front, and it included Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, some other people around the region, leftist movements, progressive movements, militant movements. And now it's called the Axis of Resistance. And essentially what it is a group of non-state militant actors, organizations in Arab countries. So you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have Hamas in Palestine, you have the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, you have the Ansarullah, otherwise known as the Houthis in Yemen, and then smaller groups here and there in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, small militant movements. But the ones I mentioned are the key ones, and they're linked with Iran. They're linked with Iran in the sense that Iran has helped them all develop militarily, training, equipment, strategic concepts, funding. It's been a major supporter once the Islamic revolution happened in Iran. The Islamic government after 1979 started to help these groups when they were born. So Hezbollah was born around 1982, Hamas around 1987, 88, something like that. These groups, so if we take Hezbollah and Hamas, they're the two critical ones. And now the Ansarullah and Yemen are important. But Hamas and Hezbollah came out of a tradition of indigenous Islamist social movements, self protection movements, people in Lebanon who were Shiites living in the south of Lebanon, mistreated, very badly mistreated by the other Lebanese. They wouldn't put up with it anymore. And so starting in the late 60s and 70s, they started working on social justice, education, jobs, etc. And a bunch of these movements later joined forces and created what came to be Hezbollah. And that's just a very quick summary. And they were involved, some of them with Arab nationalist movements, Islamist movements, different kinds of movements around the region. But so the key in Lebanon for Hezbollah was that when the Israelis invaded and occupied Lebanon, South Lebanon in 1982, the Israelis had been attacking South Lebanon repeatedly before that because the Palestine Liberation Organization groups, Fatah and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and others, had small guerrilla camps there, and they were doing things in Israel, not very serious, but they were small-scale attacks. And the Israelis kept attacking Lebanon and sometimes doing things like bombing the airport in Beirut and cutting off water supplies and whatever. So finally, and the government of Lebanon, with its army, was limited, wasn't able to protect the country. So finally, Hezbollah came into being in the early 80s and developed, with the support of the Iranians very quickly, into a more formidable military force. They continued their social justice work, their development work, and they did things in the south of Lebanon heavily, which helped everybody, including Sunnis and Christians and whatever. So if they ran a clinic or if they ran a food distribution center that would benefit all the people, but it was mostly the Shiites of Lebanon who supported them. And so this is how Hezbollah came to be. Took them 10, 20 years to develop more serious military capabilities, to the point where they fought several wars with the Israelis. And in 2006 was the last big one. I was in Beirut for then, I lived there. And the Israelis were, Hezbollah's capabilities had developed to the point where the Israelis could not wipe them out as they thought they would do. Just like the Israelis today are saying, we're going to wipe out Hamas, and I don't think they'll be able to. And they couldn't wipe out Hezbollah, and therefore they had a truce, ceasefire, and then they negotiated prisoner exchanges here and there. And there's been a pretty consistent deterrence, mutual deterrence on the Lebanon-Israel border, because they're both, Israel and Hezbollah are very powerful. They're willing to fight a war if they have to, but they prefer not to because they know that an all-out war is going to be massively destructive for all of Lebanon and all of Israel. With the rockets and the precision guidance systems and all the stuff that they both have, they can hit every part of each other's country. And they don't particularly want to do that because, first of all, it would be massively destructive. Second of all, it wouldn't solve anything because you could not, neither side can fully destroy the other. Hamas is moving in that direction and took them a long time, but they were created in the late 80s. Similar idea, they came out of an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, social progress, help the poor, help the jobless, and they gradually developed because they also did not have a Palestinian national leadership that could protect Palestinians who were refugees. They didn't have a state. Lebanon was different, it was a state, but the Palestinians did not have a state. And eventually Hamas became stronger and stronger as Arafat and Fatah and the PLO proved unable to really achieve the national goals of the Palestinians, which was to end the refugeehood, create a state, sign some kind of coexistence agreement with Israel that was fair to the Palestinians, resolve their refugeehood, and let them live in a dignified life. The PLO was unable to do this, and they finally gave in to the Oslo agreements, which proved to be a failure. And Israel kept building settlements and settlements. And so Israel has sent in 750,000 Jewish settlers into the West Bank since the Oslo agreements. There were some Jewish settlements in Gaza. They were pulled out in 2005, I think, no, 2000. The Israelis got out of Gaza because it was too costly for them. The Hamas and others were shooting at them, killing them, blowing up their facilities, and the Israelis went in with huge armaments to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. But the lesson wasn't a very effective one because they did forget. And Hamas came back 5 years later with better equipment, more sophisticated military material, and a greater determination to not forever be subjugated to the Zionist apartheid-style imperial colonial rule that they had been subjected to. They had been put under siege, they had been imprisoned, and thousands of the Palestinians were imprisoned. So Hezbollah and Hamas had similar trajectories, each in their own country. And Hamas today is perhaps near the point where Hezbollah reached, where they can force the Israelis into some kind of stalemate. Now, the Israelis have already done things that they said they wouldn't do with Hamas. They had the ceasefire. They exchanged prisoners and hostages. They allowed in more relief supplies, which they said they never would. I mean, the Israelis were trying to starve the Palestinians to death or to flee. No food, no medicine, no water. Unbelievable. There's some medieval siege stuff happening, on TV. And most of the world sitting around, saying, what do we do? And the Americans saying, oh, no ceasefire, the Israelis can defend themselves. So this kind of imperial savagery that has persisted from the first days of Zionism, where they went in and essentially said, the Palestinians have no rights. This land is ours. God gave it to us. We're going to take it over. And they did. But the corollary to that is that they saw the Palestinians as people who had no rights. That it was a bit like the blacks of South Africa. But Hamas proved them wrong. Hezbollah proved them wrong. And this is where we are today. The lesson being that there is no safety in militarism. You can drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, and it wouldn't end the resistance of the Palestinians. So what Hezbollah and Hamas and others around the area are doing is practicing what they call it resistance. It's the Hamas is an acronym in Arabic for the Harak al-Maqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. It's built into their name. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah, their common name is the resistance, al-Maqawama. Because that's what they do. They resist. They push back. And they've learned you can't go and negotiate with the Israeli leadership in a nice Intercon hotel in Washington and expect to get anything. When the Americans are leading the negotiations, they tried it. Arafat tried it, doesn't work. You have to confront them militarily. It's the only way that you're going to get anywhere. And people will debate this, but the fact is that this is what's been going on. And we'll see what happens. We're still in the middle of the road of this process. We're not at the end. We're not at the beginning. There's widespread expectation that after the fighting in Gaza stops and somehow life is allowed to resume, and they're going to have to rebuild Gaza, and there'll be different things. But there's going to have to be a serious attempt to start a political negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians, and then other Arabs need to get involved later, but one that addresses the underlying causes. Why has this been going on since the 1930s? Why have Palestinians and Zionists been shooting at each other and denying each other's rights since the 1930s? It's almost, the 2030s is only 6 years away for a century. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that one group of people says this land belongs to us, and they throw out the other, which is the Palestinians. And the Palestinians refuse to be erased from history. They refuse to be invisible people living in a context next door to others, but the others don't see them, don't recognize them, don't see that they have any rights. And this was built into the original criminal activity of the British in the Balfour Declaration, which said that a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, the British supported this, and saying that but it said they would not hurt the cultural and economic rights or civil rights or something like that of the Palestinian Arabs. They didn't talk about political rights. So from the beginning, the British colonial people said the Jews have national rights to create a state and sovereignty. The Palestinians are lesser creatures. And the Palestinians refuse this, and they're still fighting. And the 1.5 million Palestinians in 1948, Arab Palestinians, are now about 13 million. And they're still fighting. They're struggling in every way they can. The difference is they have capabilities today. They know how to do research. They know how to negotiate. They know how to do publicity. They're going to the International Criminal Court. They're going to the International Court of Justice. They're starting to use the mechanisms of conflict resolution and adjudication that are anchored in the rule of law that's supposed to be universal. The problem is, though, we're still feeling the bias, the structural, awful, grotesque criminal bias of Western leaders, where the Americans under Joe Biden will refuse, after 3 months, they still refuse to do a ceasefire in Gaza. This is totally incomprehensible to any decent human being, but it's happening. The British are pretty much like that, and others support them. So there is still this imbalance. And this is something for historians, psychologists, and sociologists, and anthropologists to explain to us. Why is there this international will by many in the West, not all, to allow the Israelis to carry on this genocidal activity and see the Palestinians as little more than local, animals, treated like animals? Why is this? And so there's many explanations that people have come up with, and this is an issue that has to be resolved so that the Israelis can live in peace in their state and the Palestinians can live in peace in their state.
Well, I think I've exhausted your substantial intelligence. We've been presenting this material for close to 1 hour. My last question, I think, would necessitate that we consider doing part two sometimes in the future, depending on the winds of war at the moment, so that we can do an entire episode on what I would like to call solutions, to which the discussion of the two-state, one-state, and permutations between the two, and maybe something entirely new could be addressed. But feel free, perhaps, to give us a sketch of the prospects of the one-state solution as a possible solution in 5 minutes or so, if you don't mind. And then that will close the session.
I would say first that the Palestinians and all the Arabs have formally recognized the state of Israel. You know, the Israelis say that the Arabs want to throw us into the sea, they want to kill Jews. That's crazy. It's nonsense. It's not true. The Arabs have formally recognized Israel. Palestinians have recognized Israel twice in their negotiations, and it was a condition for the Americans to talk to the PLO that we have to recognize Israel. And we did. And we did it again in the Oslo Agreement. The Arabs presented the Arab Peace Plan 2002. All the Arab countries and 57 Islamic majority countries, Muslim majority, also supported the Arabs in saying we will live in peace and normal relations, open borders, trade, tourism, whatever you want. If Israel withdraws from the lands occupied in 67, and the refugee issue is resolved in a negotiation that's acceptable to both sides. So we're not imposing anything on the Israelis, but we're trying to get them to move to a situation where they stop looking at us as invisible people and see us as equal human beings with equal national rights to sovereignty, security, stability, statehood, and prosperity if we can achieve it. We're not there yet because the Israelis still don't accept the idea of a Palestinian state. It's quite extraordinary. They've never responded to the Arab Peace Plan. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So when the Israelis send out propaganda that, oh, we don't have a peace partner, we don't have anybody to talk to, these are lies. This is not true. The Arabs have formally recognized Israel, and the Americans, by the way, have not responded to this very much either. So the one-state, two-state issue, my sense is that a one state is inevitable in the long run, but is impossible in the short run. There's too much bitterness, and the Israelis don't want a state that's half Arab and half Jewish, half Arab, Muslim, and Christian, and then half Jewish. They want the Jewish state. This is what Zionism's about. It's an ethno-nationalist ideology that wants a state for a religious group or a national group or whatever they want to call themselves. Some people say Judaism is a civilization. Whatever they call themselves is fine. It's not for me to define them, but it is for me to tell them that they cannot come and create their state in my home. So they don't want Arabs in their state. They want the Jewish state. So they will never accept a single state. But in the short run, I think there has to be a two-state solution, Palestinian state and Israeli state. And then after some years of people get used to a peaceful situation, we're no longer attacking each other, we're no longer denying each other's rights. Trade happens, education happens, joint agricultural projects, all kinds of water projects happen. Then slowly, a single state will emerge in everything but name, where they share the resources of the region and treat each other with equal rights. So I think this is something that'll take 2-3 decades at least, but I think it's inevitable. And when you see examples of the Israelis and Arabs, in many cases you see them living together and they're perfectly fine, and they always lived together in that way in the past. So this is not something that's impossible.
Okay, well, and let me close the show first by thanking you profusely for a historic interview befitting African Ascent's new name, namely Excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros. The episode was excellent. Excellence with Professor Teodros Kiros is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University and, of course, my home university, Berklee College of Music. It is a distinct honor for me to have had Rami Khouri, for 1 hour that felt as if it was 5 minutes. So informative, so enlightening. I'm grateful.
Well,
Thank you so much.
I'm the one who thanks you for the opportunity, and I hope we meet up and talk again, and keep going with your good, excellent work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you at Berkeley soon.
Okay, my
All
pleasure.
right.